From South Africa to Ethiopia, from Nigeria to Kenya, the whole continent of Africa is under construction. New dams, highways, ports, bridges, and railroads are springing up. And many are bankrolled by Chinese cash. Great Decisions investigates how American policymakers are responding to China's presence in Africa, explores how the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting China's ties to the continent, and asks how African governments can navigate the increasingly bitter rivalry between Washington and Beijing. Competing interests, the US and China in Africa. Next on Great Decisions.
Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Herford Foundation, PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP, and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.
Roberts International Airport, the main gateway to the West African nation of Liberia, was in dire need of refurbishment.
Finally, that shame that we all, and we do feel shame when we land at the airport, and the plane is just going, you know.
But cash-strapped Liberia could not afford the $50 million price tag to renovate the passenger terminal. So Liberian officials made the same decision as their counterparts in countless other countries across Africa and around the world. They turned to China.
I was a liaison between the president's office and the Chinese embassy. And one of the projects we ended up doing with the Chinese was the rehabilitation of the terminal at Roberts International Airport. What I would say about the Chinese process is how fast it is. The speed with which we can negotiate a deal is really important.
The same pattern has been repeated in nearly every African country.
There is hardly anywhere in Nigeria that you go to today that you don't see the visibility of China in terms of infrastructural projects. You see that they are constructing or remodeling projects from the airport to roads to hospitals to everywhere.
Ethiopia borrowed about 1.3 billion for the Addis-Djibouti railway. Kenya borrowed 2 billion for the rail lines. Those are incredibly huge projects and much needed infrastructure development in Africa.
Now, American policymakers from both parties are speaking out about the need for the US to counter China's rapid expansion in Africa.
China is not at all blind to the fact that there's a Southern Hemisphere, and they're making huge investments in Africa. They have a lot of resources on the table. I think we need to make sure we put the resources on the table. We need to step it up.
Just reducing our investment provides, of course, opportunity for other players to step in. Other players that have more efficient governments than we do, albeit not very transparent and not very virtuous governments like China. We have to be really careful. I always say I'd rather invest in the peaceful tools of feeding hungry people and infrastructure development and healthcare and energy than in the weapons of war.
For 4 years, the Trump administration put America's global rivalry with China at the center of its foreign policy.
It's clear to me that the United States is concerned about China, that Africa is part of that. When the United States released an Africa strategy a few years ago, it was primarily a China strategy. And if you look at the comments that the then National Security Advisor Bolton made when that strategy was released, it was mostly about China.
China uses bribes, opaque agreements, and the strategic use of debt to hold states in Africa captive to Beijing's wishes and demands.
I think in the case of Africa, the Chinese have made extraordinary efforts to increase their influence. So I think it's perfectly legitimate for the U.S. and European countries to be worried about what China's up to there. I think China's pursuing a very, very long-range strategy. And I don't think the United States for many years really had any coherent response.
But U.S. policymakers face a difficult question: how to counter China at a time when American politicians have little appetite to spend money on foreign aid.
The United States will no longer provide indiscriminate assistance across the entire continent without focus or prioritization.
Essentially, what Ambassador Bolton was trying to lay out was that the U.S. is going to target its funding towards key countries and particular strategic objectives. We, the U.S., need to get back in the game, but it's very difficult to get back in the game while also focusing on reducing the amount of development assistance to African nations.
U.S. officials are counting on the American private sector to make up the difference.
Taxpayer investment in Africa should incentivize other generosity. I think to the degree we can, we ought to work with our private sector partners to get them to go into Africa and help solve problems and make investments.
Let's marshal all of the power of American economic might in Africa and elsewhere, not just state resources, but also the resources of American private sector that promotes entrepreneurship. It promotes economic development, not just reliance upon the government that's writing a big check.
You simply cannot fill the void with American private investment going into the continent. I'm all for American private investment. I would like to see a lot more of it. But even our exports to Africa have not increased significantly in recent years.
I know as a former diplomat that we always wanted American companies to be involved in the countries that we were in, but we also have to think about what American companies are willing to risk. And China sees Africa as an opportunity, and American businesses tend to see Africa as a problem.
Lots of the US firms or European firms don't have the sufficient resources or risk appetite towards Africa. When talking about Africa, the Chinese do have a medium to long-term vision, and sometimes they are willing to take a relatively lower investment return.
In recent decades, Western creditors have moved away from funding large-scale infrastructure projects in the developing world.
Prior to the 80s, one of the biggest funders of infrastructure projects on the continent was the World Bank. So the World Bank had this ideological shift in the 90s to say, we don't do big infrastructure. There was this idea that the state needed to be taken out of economic activity. So what happened in Africa was a huge backlog of infrastructure projects over the years. We were lagging behind in power, in roads, in hospitals.
Now, many African governments in their national development plans, they put infrastructure first. And Western countries, including the US, have invested much less in infrastructure and invested more in aspects related to health, education, governance, promotion of democracy, and so on.
What is the sense in discussing for years to get a loan from the World Bank or from whoever? African countries, people are actually facing a lot of real life problems. People are dying because of poverty. Poverty is being multiplied across generations. So we don't have time to talk about some of these things.
But now, China's expanding influence in Africa has some Western policymakers rethinking the turn away from infrastructure.
I can detect, even with the most reluctant donors and the most reluctant economic partners of Africa, a change of attitude and much more interested on infrastructure, particularly after China has been much more ahead of the curve in terms of providing this type of support.
China has growing influence in Africa because they have a development bank that is willing to underwrite major infrastructure projects. The United States does not have that capacity, and there's no reason that we shouldn't. We can compete with China for economic influence in places like Africa, but only if we put on the table the kind of development deals that the Chinese are.
Yet, despite Washington's increasing interest in Africa, some experts question whether the U.S. is prepared to make the necessary political commitment to the continent.
Since 1990, the first overseas trip every year by the Chinese foreign minister is to Africa. And how many times has Secretary of State of the United States traveled to Africa in the past 10 years? The Chinese are willing to throw in the political capital. They're willing to throw in the economic capital.
Throughout the 90s and early aughts, U.S. policy toward Africa was actually through a prism of development and humanitarian assistance. Africa wasn't seen as a place to do business until the Chinese came. The U.S. has never had to compete, really. But now, you're not the only actor out there.
First case of coronavirus confirmed in Nigeria.
Algeria, 20 cases. Burkina Faso, 2.
Fellow Ghanaians, I took the step to close all our borders.
Egypt, 59.
And I ordered a mandatory quarantine and testing.
Senegal, 5. Togo, 1.
D'un premier cas confirmé de coronavirus COVID-19.
With regard to the situation in Botswana, so far, 14 suspected cases.
This is a global crisis. Delay in action means death.
Without decisive action, the number of people infected will rapidly increase from a few hundred to tens of thousands.
When the COVID-19 pandemic hit Africa in the spring of 2020, Beijing sensed an opportunity. Both the Chinese government and private philanthropists, such as the Jack Ma Foundation, stepped in to provide critical supplies.
The market for PPE was overwhelmed and there were shortages, so they couldn't really obtain it, even if they had the money for it. So when China provided the equipment or the materials, that was immensely appreciated by so many countries in Africa.
We have received 20,000 test kits from the Jack Ma Foundation and assorted personal protective equipment.
Social media platforms like WhatsApp are incredibly popular on the African continent. During the height of the pandemic, initially what was being sent around was that famous video of the Chinese constructing a hospital in record time. And there were lots of screenshots of Jack Ma's Twitter account that were floating around.
When the PRC sent a medical team to Algeria in April of 2020 in order to help with the fight against COVID-19, the rhetoric and the discourse used then was that this is only a continuation of a practice that has started in the 1960s when the PRC in 1963 sent the first medical team to Algeria. We've seen the PRC providing equipment, but also really accompanying that with the narrative that China and Africa have always been through a lot of challenges together.
As China captured attention across the African continent, some analysts worried that China's generosity might overshadow the support that the U.S. has given over many decades to improve healthcare in Africa.
We've taken note of the very modest financial donations that China and so-called private Chinese entities have dispersed in Africa. China's contributions to fighting the pandemic are paltry.
When you're providing $30 million and supporting the local Ministry of Health, that's good for a 2-paragraph story on page 4 of the local press, and that's about it, and then it disappears. When Jack Ma of Alibaba flies in a plane load of protective gear, you get 4 or 5 times the publicity.
We urge the Americans to use their energy on fighting the epidemic at home. Their attempt to undermine friendly relations between China and Africa will never succeed.
The world is not so transactional as, you give $1 for a vaccine and you get $1 worth of credit, where people are keeping these ledgers. People are keeping ledgers in their minds as to which countries are constructive actors in the international system, which countries give out of a sense of solidarity and a sense of being connected.
I think the United States is doing much more than it is given credit for, and it is extremely important to acknowledge. People will overlook that the United States has been involved with the continent for decades, has been involved in education, in healthcare, in human rights.
In April 2020, Chinese diplomats in Africa were forced to do damage control amid allegations of racism in the southern city of Guangzhou. There, some Chinese landlords had evicted African tenants, fearful that the African diaspora might transmit COVID-19.
There were also stories about restaurants refusing service to members of the African diaspora in Guangzhou, several parks that prohibited the Africans from going in. And so these issues started up a big conversation about racism and about race in China.
China was very quickly put under the spotlight of international scrutiny, and this created much diplomatic problems between China and African countries. In fact, multiple African governments sent their letters of protest to Chinese government. They summoned the Chinese ambassador to lodge their complaint about the treatment of the African nationals in Guangzhou.
It has been very much spread across social media. For those who were very much thinking that, that China is so different from the West on these particular issues, I think this has revealed that there's also a race issue in China, especially towards Black Africans.
But China was not the only country to grapple with concerns about racism in the spring of 2020.
The same way Africans were shocked by the fact that some Africans were poorly treated by some Chinese in China during the COVID-19 pandemic, they were eventually even more shocked by the fact that they were able to witness the police reaction to the Black Lives Matter movement.
Anywhere where Black people tend to be treated badly, it tends to have lots of resonance on the continent. Chinese one was very surprising, precisely because China itself has been trying to spin this story of like, we are your friends, we're Africa's friends. Everybody else who's come before has treated you guys badly, but now we're equal partners. My sense is that the typical African is resigned to expect that kind of behavior from the US authorities towards Blacks.
Now, with African economies strained to the breaking point, both Chinese and Western creditors face urgent calls for debt relief.
What's happened with the pandemic is that African export revenues have shrunk. Most countries in Africa are still reliant on raw material exports for their economies, or things like tourism. These sectors have been hit very hard, and this means that those governments, those countries, don't have the revenues that they need in order to import medicine. They don't have the revenues they might need to import food.
Despite the very close relations between China and Africa, their debt relief efforts so far have been extremely timid. They have been very reluctant to engage through the G20 or other multilateral debt discussion fora, and they have focused on this bilateral type of negotiations.
They particularly have said that they would like to negotiate debt on a country-by-country basis, whereas African countries are trying to negotiate their debts collectively. There's a bit of a feeling that China is ambivalent on its stance.
The latest opinion polls, including an Afrobarometer survey of 18 countries completed in 2020, reveal that ordinary Africans are eager to learn from the experiences of both China and the US.
In your opinion, which of the following countries, if any, would be the best model for the future development of your country? And the United States ranked first here, 32%, and China ranked second with 23%.
It's difficult to know how many African countries really fully understand what is China's model of development. What they do see is a country that has done an enormous job at reducing poverty. They would like to emulate that. That doesn't mean they really understand how China got there.
They've lifted how many hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And so African governments look at that and they think they can learn something from China. The other part of the Chinese experience is that they're run by the Communist Party. It's an authoritarian dictatorship. And I don't think that's very attractive in Africa.
It also remains to be seen whether China can transform its economic clout into widespread interest in Chinese society and culture.
China has been quite successful in building a sense of its own power and utility in that China is a very important economic and political player in Africa, and it can't be ignored across the continent. But I don't think that that's translated into a genuine sense of affection for China.
Not a lot of African people know a lot about China, but more and more that relationship and that image has changed over the last few years, and this is in part due to multiple projects and initiatives that encourage African students and Africans in general to travel to China for scholarships or for long-term trainings.
You now have a situation where Nigerian students are being sponsored to go to Chinese universities to learn things like engineering. The idea is they go to China, learn, and they come back to manage the railway that is being built by China. China is now one of the most popular destinations for African students, surpassing the US, surpassing the UK.
In recent years, more and more Africans have begun to study the Chinese language.
There is a wide variety of interest among African students who wants to learn Chinese. They see that if a lot of projects are being done by Chinese companies and corporations, then it becomes important for them to learn the language in order to be able to secure job opportunities with a lot of these Chinese firms.
Countries like Uganda, Kenya, South Africa include Mandarin courses in school curricula very early. However, the Afrobarometer in its last survey included a question stating which language African citizens consider to be the language of the future. And English largely scored the first rank, and this is not surprising.
China is not a place you go to for some glamorous outing. When folks say, I came back from China, stories are, I came back from China, you won't believe what they have done with their highways. Nobody ever says, I came back from China, I went and watched a great Chinese play. It's a practical country. It's a place that you go to visit to learn about practicalities and not to enjoy life.
As relations between China and the US sour, African leaders must navigate the thorny landscape of what some commentators have characterized as a new scramble for Africa.
Africa ultimately is going to make its own decisions about what is best for them. We shouldn't view Africa as a colonial era chessboard in which we are trying to compete with Russia or China for influence and control. We should be invested in the African people.
I think it'd be really naive to say that there aren't spheres in which China and the United States are competitors, but there are places where Chinese and American interests align. One of those places is development in Africa. So the last thing Africa needs is Chinese-American competition. We don't need that. We've got enough problems of our own.
Today, Africa is home to 5 of the world's 10 fastest growing economies and is poised to double its population by 2050. It is also one of the places most vulnerable to emerging threats and the changing climate. In the decades to come, no matter how the U.S. rivalry with China develops, Africa is poised to take center stage in the foreign policy of both countries.
Great Decisions is America's largest discussion program on global affairs. Discussion groups meet online via Zoom and Google Meets, in person at community centers, libraries, places of worship, and homes across the country to discuss global issues with their community. Participants read the 8-topic briefing book, meet to discuss each topic, and complete a ballot which shares their views with Congress. To start or join a discussion group in your community, visit fpa.org or call 1-800-477-5836. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Herford Foundation, PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP, and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.